Good morning, I'm Wayworn Worm, and welcome to my channel. I'm back. It's been a few years. I'll have a channel update soon-ish. Long story short, I've been banging my head against the wall in a single video for a few years, and I've been busy. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. This video was a response to Hank Green's video, Who is Creating the Non-Human Army, that he uploaded onto Hank's channel on December 3rd, 2024. This started being written the next day when I saw the video. It was originally going to be a comment that I left on the video, but as I was planning out what I was going to type, it just kept ballooning in size, and I realized I have a surprising amount to say about this. So, before we begin, I'm going to make a suggestion that is arguably bad for this video, but I think it's the right way to do things and will make the most sense. If you haven't seen Hank's video, please pause this and go and watch at least the first 8 minutes and 10 seconds of his video. That's the whole meat of the video. I will try to have the link to that video in several places to make it easy as possible for you to go watch. I'll probably be in the description, a pinned comment, and in one of the corners. Okay, so I assume if you're watching this from this point on that you've seen Hank's video. But both as a way to frame my response and because I know not everyone will have watched his video, let me summarize what I'm responding to. Keep in mind, again, that I am assuming you have seen his video, and by the very nature of someone summarizing someone else's work, something is always going to be lost. So, once again, I do recommend you watch his video. If you've been keeping up with Hank lately, you know that he's been thinking a lot about how Bluesky is/isn't like Twitter and Threads. When thinking about how Bluesky is separate from its underlying protocol, he posted his thoughts about that part on Bluesky, and he ran into a reply from an account stating that it disagreed with him. And although he didn't think it was a good argument, he thought that point of view was intriguing enough that he tried to engage this account in conversation, only for it to never reply. Looking at the replies it has made, he realized that every single reply is a generative AI prompt, where what is likely happening is the post being replied to is plugged into whatever large language model is being used, and the prompt is disagree with that post. It almost fooled him, but the fact that every single reply starts with some phrase that can essentially boil down to, I disagree with what you just said, tipped him off. Something left unsaid in the video, but is implied both due to the title and as well as, honestly, just a tiny bit of critical thinking. If there is one account like this, there are untold more. In the little bit of research I did while creating this video, I have heard of at least one block list of nothing but accounts of this kind, and I'm pretty sure I ran into one just the other day. What seems to happen is they'll create the account, make one reply talking about some community. In the one with Hank, it was about they were looking to find dog Twitter. And the one that I found, it was about tabletop games. So all of that leads to the question, why? Why do these exist? And possibly more importantly, relatedly, what is their ultimate goal? And that's the question I want to talk about in this video. Spoiler alert, sorry, I don't have an answer to that question. We're just going to kind of go over a few things. Hank proposed several things that could be the goal, and I want to talk about them. First, we need to go down a couple more context tangents, and then we'll be on to what I want to talk about. On my last video that I made, it was about David Politis. It was the first video of mine, and so far only, to go kind of beyond my circle. go outside of who normally sees my videos. The comments of that video can really be separated into two camps. Camp 1 is a discussion on if David is or is not a grifter. Interesting, but not related. Camp 2 were criticisms about me. One of the more common criticisms was that I don't get to my point very quickly. I suspect that some amount of these comments, possibly all of them, were made in bad faith, such as the ones that are just like, your voice is annoying. Well, then don't watch. But I'm going to treat the comments that I don't get to my point very quickly as if they are made in good faith. You might argue and say that I take too long to get to the point and I mention things that I say I'm going to talk about and then take forever to get there. I am on a continuum where the extreme end are those videos on Facebook and the like, where they promise they're about to do something that'll look really cool, and it will take like 15 seconds. But they sit there and they promise they're just about to do it for like 5 or 10 minutes before finally, yay, it's done, and those were a cool couple of seconds. But generally, you're too annoyed to enjoy that. And I think that's a disrespecting of the time of everyone who was watching that video. I get that. I get where that's coming from. You can pump out a whole bunch of those videos. They're very low effort, and they are long enough, and they keep people on the hook long enough that you're going to be rewarded by the system that Facebook has up. But yeah, I think it's a callous waste and disregard of the only truly finite resource everyone has. I would argue that the other end of that continuum is saying something with no context at all in as short of a time as possible. And I think that is also disrespectful of the viewer, as you're leaving out needed context. The viewer is not going to get the same thought as what you were trying to communicate by the video without putting out any context, and they might come to wrong conclusions because you don't have context. There are a lot of things that seem one way without context and are completely different when you put context in. Ultimately, these videos that I make are scripted, unless I say otherwise, because my normal method of talking involves tangent after tangent and eventually getting back to where I went off into tangent land. But there are times where it's been half an hour or longer since those tangents started, and sometimes I'm like 8 tangents deep, and then go back 3 tangents because I didn't finish at that point, and then eventually just work my way back. So I script these to keep the tangents at a minimum and try to strike the happy medium between providing enough context for everyone to understand what I'm saying and going too far into tangents that are questionable about how much they provide to the viewer. Which is why I probably won't be doing this section again, or at least very often. Okay, so tangent about why I tangent is over. Now on to the last, I don't even want to call it a tangent. It's more of, it's background, needed background, before we get to what I actually want to talk about. We're just going to quickly talk about my experience on Bluesky because it really colors my thoughts on this subject in particular. I joined Bluesky in summer of 2023, used it for a bit, and then I took about a year off from essentially all social media. I happened to start coming back to Bluesky as this latest large exodus from Twitter happened. This is in mid-December 2024 when I'm making this video. and Bluesky users soared. If I remember right, at least in the thick of it, it was like 1 million new users a day, every day for a week or more. Um, but at the time that this started, that I was getting back into Bluesky, I was sitting at 27 followers. And I had been for most of the time I was using that platform. Mid-November, I was put into a couple of starter packs by some really good friends of mine, and I went from 27 to 100 in less than 48 hours. I'm now in the upper 180s, and well, obviously that growth has slowed way down. I highly doubt those 80, 90 some odd people would have followed without that huge 48-hour jump. It is hard to know the exact number because there are a lot of bots that have been purged and people who followed me only to unfollow a day or two later when I didn't follow them back. When I think of whitelists on Bluesky, I think of starter packs. And my thoughts on starter packs are always going to be colored by the fact that I went from essentially shouting into a void to having people there listening because I was put in a couple starter packs. So that's going to be a factor. Okay, I think that's all the context that needed to fully understand on my take on these fake accounts and what the motivation for making them could be. A big assumption that Hank, and I for that matter, make about these accounts is that the cost of operating them, which would be, I assume, I have reason to assume that would be the main barrier to making these accounts. Therefore, the cost of operating must be very low, basically to the point of it's negligible. And I don't just mean money when I say cost of operating. Or a second thing is they think of very large paydays at the end of this, which I think a very large payday is unlikely, no matter what their purpose is, and these seem a little too sophisticated for someone to think of very large paydays at the end of it, because that is a bit naive. Now, the first thing Hank suggests in his video is creating these accounts that have a history and interaction and followers is to later switch them to spam accounts. It's possible, and it's something that I'm very much not going to say no, it's not an option about. I don't think Hank is right here, but I'm not going to disagree with him. I'm not going to say no, this is not a possibility. I don't think it's very likely. I think the cost of operating to go through the time and effort needed for such a, at least relatively long con that they seem to be going on the cost of operation would have to be zero. And I also think it's thinking a little small fry. It feels a bit like coming across a scam in 2024 and assuming it's a Nigerian prince scam or a Spanish prisoner scam. Yes, I know those are essentially the same thing. When any scam you come across this year is likely much more sophisticated than those. To me, the idea that you're making these accounts to eventually make them into spam accounts, just that seems a little old-fashioned and of a smaller time. But I don't know. What I thought when Hank was talking about the history and the interaction and followers seemingly be the goal was I was thinking that creating accounts, getting refollowers to eventually sell the account. I would imagine that on a market where you were selling accounts, and I will admit I have zero experience in this. This is just theoretical, so I could be wrong. But I imagine that on such a market, if you can show that the account has real, actual people following it rather than just bot follows, that it would be worth more. And the usernames of all of these accounts that I've heard of are generic enough that it wouldn't be super weird if someone bought it and went down a certain path with it. Like the one that Hank found was Flowers. The one I found was like R2D 2G4, something like that. And the the block list that I mentioned earlier, apparently part of the reason why they were able to find them all is all of the usernames were some variation on the word bubbles. But the reason why I bring up, the whole generic username sort of things is if someone's username was CryptoBro69420 and they went from replying about how they disagree with statements and having a semi-decent argument in that agreement to posting propaganda about how Vietnam needs to reestablish Indochina and use it to dominate their neighbors, that'd be weird. CryptoBro69420 talking about spreading nationalist Vietnamese propaganda would be weird. But an account like the one Hank found, where the username is Flowers, they make one post about trying to find people from dog Twitter and have been replying about how they disagree with various statements and having the semi-decent argument, blah, 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 blah. And then all of a sudden they pivot to Vietnamese expansionist propaganda, or they pivot to crypto, or whatever it ends up being. That seems believable enough. And quick side note, I don't know why, when my brain was blanking on something to pivot from why it decided Vietnamese expansionist propaganda, which I don't think exists. I don't know why that was what my brain came up with, but it was. So there we go. All of this to say that the long con to eventually turn them into spam accounts, if these accounts are destined to be sold to someone who thinks, or someone who wants to buy a ready-made audience, I can see the argument for spam account for selling them. I just, again, think it's quaint and it's thinking small. So let's think bigger. Let's expand on a possibility that Hank brushed against, but passed by actually really quickly. What if these accounts are existing just to further disagreement and discord? It could be a company that decided that Bluesky, at least as it currently exists, failing would be in its interest. It could be that the company disagrees with Bluesky's stance on monetization through ads being not the right fit for Bluesky, or it could be that the company has blacked a Bluesky competitor, or any of a million other reasons. It could be a political operative who, rightly or wrongly, has decided that Bluesky has too many leftists and such, and it needs to be disrupted. And if we're going to be talking about political operatives, we need to think even bigger. It could be any of a number of countries that have been waging a propaganda campaign against the West for years now. And we say the West with those air quotes because although both the targets of these campaigns and those waging the campaigns would probably use that phrase, we put it in air quotes because we know they mean NATO and NATO-aligned countries. There are countries that are by any definition in the west part of the globe, although with a globe, because if you keep going west, you're eventually going to just circle around and hit your original starting point from the east. We have decided an arbitrary line. It actually passes through Jerusalem. That's why the Middle East is Middle East. Here I go on a weird tangent. But from what we have arbitrarily decided is the West, there are countries in there that are not NATO or NATO aligned, and they're not really being targeted in the same way. And Australia, New Zealand, Japan, just for three examples in the extreme east, that they are being targeted by these same things. Now, this broader explanation it feels like it could be right. Label it a covert disruption plan and lay it at the feet of a corporation targeting Bluesky, or a right-wing political operative targeting anyone they think isn't politically pure enough, or a country targeting the populace of nations that it's aligned against, or whatever you want to put in similar. But at the end of the day, that, although it feels right, it also feels too easy, and it's not really something we can do anything about. I mean, it is, but it isn't. And anyway, beyond all that, Hank brushed by this idea and just kept running. So let's talk about possibly the most interesting thing it could be. It might be a campaign to sow discord to the point where you have to rely on either block lists or white lists of verified real people. Best part about this idea is it can fit alongside that last possibility we just talked about. And here's one of the reasons why, when you write a script and then you take a while to record it, this next bit is wrong. I don't think it's a both and situation. I think it is an either or situation. I think this is something where you want to proliferate the use of one type of list instead of trying to proliferate both types of lists. So let's separate the two and talk about why someone might want to create a culture where everyone uses block lists, or a culture where everyone is using white lists. And then we'll talk about both of them together. Now, you'd want block lists to be a thing that the culture of Bluesky values, because it will give individual people an outsized ability to influence who gets a seat at the table to talk to the wider platform. If most people use block lists and you've created the most popular block list, a large portion of people have ceded to you the power of making sure they don't hear from what you have labeled as bad actors. If your block list is large enough and legitimate looking enough, with most people on that list falling under whatever you title the list to be, most people are likely just going to trust that you're being honest with the title and or description and block everyone on that list rather than checking through the entire list. And keep in mind, someone who uses one block list is more likely to use multiple block lists. Now, from block lists on Twitter and even some on Bluesky, we know that gay, lesbian, and or trans people and or actual leftists, and or a mix of all of the above, but mainly trans people, accidentally end up on block lists titled things like assholes in the tabletop RPG space or fascist lovers way, way more often than chance would indicate they would. If someone subscribes to a block list, as I said, it's more likely that they'll sign up for multiple. So what's to stop you from creating a block list called fascist lovers, making it hundreds or thousands of accounts long, with the vast majority of them being actual fascists, and you slip a few prominent trans folk into the block list, relying on people just not checking? What is then to stop your close friend from making a block list called Nazi shitheads? Again, make it very long, with the vast majority of accounts on that list being Nazi shitheads. and they slip a few more prominent trans people who aren't on your block list. So, with the two very long block lists, the two of you have reduced the reach of prominent trans folk. And you shut them up without anybody realizing it. But there's a downside to that, and labeling them something that they're clearly not. And that is, if someone ever notices and brings to your attention that a prominent trans person is incorrectly on your block list, well, you get to say, oops, I didn't know how they got there. You'll remove them, and then you rely on your third friend having them on their block list named right-wing nutjobs. You get to pretend to be innocent in all of this, and after a while, preferably before someone notices that trans person has been added to right-wing nutjobs, again incorrectly, you can quietly re-add them and continue to limit their reach. But with that, you are relying on Bluesky's reputation for having a more centrist and leftish people on it who are likely to sign up to block lists with that name. The problem with that reliance is that when someone notices one of these accounts that you've slipped into your block list, the choice before you is to either go fully mask off and lose all credibility and just hope that that credibility loss can be managed to a small area, or you feign ignorance and you remove them, and you will likely still end up with that person at least a little suspicious of you. Now, if there's a huge problem with decently believable bots and block lists are springing up named things like bots to block, you have a lot more room to argue about why a trans person accidentally ended up on that block list. Your block list also has plausibility for being absurdly long to the point where no one could feasibly check all the accounts on that list. And so you can add people to it and potentially not, and just be like, oh shit, I don't know how that person ended up there. And the suspicion is not necessarily there. But it also makes it more likely that someone creating a new block list for bots that has no affiliation to you or what you're doing at all is just going to copy your list in part or in whole and then add to it. All in all, it seems like an elegant next step to continue, again, in bad faith, mind you, to put people on block lists they don't belong on in an effort to limit their reach. It kind of seems like an extension to that. And now there's the other side of that coin, whitelists. And as I mentioned earlier, when I think of whitelists on Bluesky, I think of starter packs. These are the opposite of block lists. They're lists of people to follow. You create a starter pack to tell your community, hey, I think you should follow these people. And it lends those people at least part of your credibility. Now, I think in that last bit I laid out pretty well why someone might want to create a bot problem to then use that to lower the reach of some people with block lists. With whitelists / starter packs, it's not quite as clear of a path. And the reason is the bad actors can't really directly influence these lists. Like, if say, Nick Fuentes started a whitelist called Verified Human Accounts, anyone who followed that list wouldn't need the fiction that the only reason why accounts are on that list are because they're verified humans. He could just openly call them Nazis. I mean his friends. Same thing. Now, imagine there is a huge bot problem, and there is an account that builds a reputation of being a bulwark against these bot accounts, and they start a whitelist called verified human accounts. Nick Fuentes, as a real known human being, might find himself on that very long list. Someone who is susceptible to Fuentes, or at least the alt-right pipeline, we're still calling it that, right? Might find themselves following him because he is on a verified human account starter pack, and they followed because they only want to see stuff from real people. Now, I said that I thought this possibility was an either or thing, not a both and thing, but as I'm writing this, especially about how Nick Fuentes, and I'm picking on him because he's just who came to mind when I thought of a total garbage shitbag human being. How he could end up on a whitelist, a new possibility came to my mind. I would say Nick Fuentes again for who could be behind something like this, but let's be honest, he's too lazy to put in the work needed to pull this off. Right-wing shitbag, or probably more likely troll farm reporting to the Kremlin, or whatever bad actor or actors, again, probably multiple, probably actors you want to slot in here. They create one or more alt accounts. These accounts are used a lot, and each post is written by a human being. They all gain these reputations as bulwarks against bots, as the other part of this group of shitbags works on creating a giant bot problem. Part of the reputation building could be unmasking some really realistic bot accounts, and they know what account is a bot account because the group that they're a part of is operating that bot. Now, when these large anti-bot accounts start coming out with block lists of bots and whitelists of verified human accounts, then these popular accounts are able to put together these massively long lists, and, well, wouldn't you know, whatever group is designated by this group behind all of this as the enemy, be it trans folk or gay folk or leftists or whoever, that group, the enemy group, has a lot of their prominent members accidentally put on the bot block lists, and the group that is who the people behind these alts want to amplify, well, they just happen to be overrepresented in the verified human lists. Don't know how that happened. The reason why I didn't think about this a possibility until midnight 30 after a few hours of writing this in not the first writing session is because it would take a lot of work. And now keep in mind, although I am framing it as one group that is doing both sides of it, the group making these alts to take advantage of the bot problem could just be being opportunistic. But it just takes a lot of work to do something like this. And back in the beginning of the video, we laid out and accepted the premise that the reasons these bot accounts are proliferating is because their operating cost is so low. The time and the effort put into the long game of creating these proposed alt accounts that fight against the swelling bot problem, that flies directly in the face of the idea that these bot accounts are so common because they are cheap to make. But the more I think about this possibility, and the more I've learned in the last few months about how absolutely deep Russian interference in American elections since at least 2015, probably earlier, and probably other countries. I believe they're suspected to have had at least somewhat of a hand in the Brexit vote. The less outlandish, I think the idea of someone on the absolute cutting edge of cyberware coming up with a long-term subtle propaganda campaign that involves shaping the culture of the new big thing in the social media space to be able to easily influence the reach of specific accounts. It's less, I think it's less outlandish. Even if there's no current plan on how to use that power that could come from these block lists and whitelists, I could see someone with enough forethought setting it up now when it's easy to do. If Bluesky's culture is still forming, it is solidifying in several ways, but it's still a lot more malleable now than it will be in 6 months, in a year, whatever. But yeah, I could see someone with enough forethought setting that up now when it's easy to do so they can use it in the future. Now that's kind of paranoid. But I can... The problem is, at the end of the day, there is a reason why these bot accounts exist. And in all probability, it's a bunch of reasons. It's a bunch of different people creating different bot accounts for different reasons. And we don't know why. I just talked about several ideas. You can probably tell that at least the most interesting idea to me, which is possibly a sign that it's wrong, is this idea of propagating the bots to influence the culture of Bluesky for unknown ends. But I don't know. So I leave that to you to think about. If you've made it this far and you haven't subscribed, please do. I'd appreciate it. Like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you disliked it. Let's hear your talks in the comments. Or if you end up making a reply to this because your comment is going to be too long, I feel you deeply in my soul, and just let me know, and I'll try to watch it. Share it with anyone who you think will get something out of this. The bot that runs YouTube thinks you'll like one of these videos off to the side, and yeah, have a great day.